Welcome to Uprising. Each episode looks inside what it takes to lead the most dynamic and successful cultural movements. Some of them in the business world, some in the social realm, some in politics, and some in between. To see why people start uprisings, what gives those initiatives momentum and keeps them going, and most important, what lessons can you learn from these movements and how to apply them to your business and even personal life. Let's explore the secret to sparking movements that move people into action.
Passionate ideas.
Controversial ideas.
Uprising ideas.
The power is now in the hands of anyone.
To start a cultural movement.
Your movement.
To move the world.
In the book, Your Band Sucks, author Jon Fine takes us along for his 80s punk group's life, death, and everything in between. Today on Uprising...
Including the reunion.
Including and reunion.
Sorry, spoilers.
That's totally good. That's good. So today on Uprising, you got a bonus there. We're going to talk about music. We're going to get into the new music scene, reminisce about what happened in the 1980s. But we're also going to talk about something equally interesting, especially when it comes to movements, and namely teenage men and 20-something men on a mission to change the world. So I have Jon Fine with me today, author, executive editor-in-chief of Inc. magazine, guitarist, cultural commentator, impresario. Welcome to Uprising. Welcome to the show, Jon.
Great to be here, Scott. Thanks so much.
You're welcome. So, are you done playing music? Is it over?
I don't know. I mean, I keep thinking I am, but it keeps sort of sucking me back in. It's funny you mention that because, I want to be clear about this. I'm not in an active band right now, and I have enough friends who are active musicians doing real things. Like, I know that what I do while I'm sort of sitting around on the couch and occasionally recording on my iPhone, doesn't count as doing music. But having said that, I've just I keep thinking I'm done, but I just sort of developed this newfound interest in guitar again. And I had this old broken down weird 70s guitar that I finally had fixed up, and I'm just really enthralled with it. I'm going to bring it to my office at work so I have it at work while I have the other ones at home. And I seem to find a way to play at least a half an hour a day now, which is the first time I could say that in a long time. So who knows?
So when you look at what's going on in music today, what do you sort of see? What's out there? What's the challenges? What are the problems?
Well, it's funny. I've done a lot of readings and events around my book, and inevitably at every one of them someone asks some version of is the internet ruining music? Is it making it impossible to be a band? And embedded in that question, because these are generally people around my age and I'm in my 40s, is the assumption that there was this golden time. There was a golden time of record stores and college radio stations and bookstores and, little places where we gathered to, be ourselves, be part of this weird indie rock / punk rock underground of the 80s and 90s. That world is gone in a lot of ways in the visible sense of it. Record stores are gone. Two of my favorite record stores in America, in fact, closed in the last month. Other Music in New York City, fabulous store. And Aquarius Records in San Francisco, which may have been the longest running independent record store going. It was going since 1970, and they finally couldn't do it anymore. So, I feel the loss of all that stuff, but, and while it's different and perhaps harder to do band things like find an audience, and it's definitely impossible to make money off recorded music. There are just different ways of getting the word out. There's obviously been this explosion in distribution. There's been good and bad with that. But my gut feeling with this stuff, and I'm constantly saying this to people who disagree with me at these book events, I can't argue against, more distribution of music being a bad thing. When I was in my teens, you would hear about a band like the Stooges or the Sex Pistols, and then you'd have to find the fucking record. And it would take, it would take me years to find stuff, and you talk to other people and they're like, yeah, man, I've heard about that too. I just don't know where it is, and that just doesn't happen anymore. And I can't be convinced. I don't want to minimize the collateral damage that the internet has wreaked on music as well as many other creative industries. But I mean, more people having access to more things. I mean, I just can't argue that that's a bad thing.
So what do you think is going to, I guess, save whatever's left of the music industry?
Well, I mean, I guess probably the best thing to do is to like draw a line between music and the music industry. The music industry, as any business that was built on artificially high margins and artificial scarcity, I mean, it's going to keep collapsing until it's the size that, actually makes sense in a world where there isn't scarcity of distribution and you can't artificially jack up prices. I mean, and I don't necessarily, I mean, I've got friends who've lost jobs because of that. I have friends who've closed down record labels that I cared about deeply because of that. But I mean, business changes. At the same time, there's just an absolute explosion of creativity in music because there's so many more ways to play with songs, mix things up. There's different ways to collaborate with musicians. There's different ways to get your stuff out. I mean, I'll give you an example, which is now dated a couple of years, but I just love this so much. Someone, a good friend of mine, who was a co-owner of that record store in San Francisco, Aquarius, sent me a link a couple of years ago. It was Bandcamp, which is one of the platforms where people can post their own music. It was a band called Apprentice Destroyer. This fabulous sort of trancey kind of krautrocky stuff, mostly synthesizers, but not exclusively. Apprentice Destroyer is one guy, and the shtick on Apprentice Destroyer is that it was recorded entirely on a simple digital recorder at Guitar Centers. He did all the performance and recording in music stores, bit by bit. I mean, that's just fucking amazing. He did that for nothing. I mean, there were costs of possibly getting chased up by a security guard. But, if you wanted to make a record when my bands were around, and, I started playing in bands that made records in 1986. It was like, we want to make a record. Great. Okay. So we got to pay for studio time, and we got to pay for tape because, you were paying for these big, thick rolls, these big, specialized recording tapes, and they were a couple $100 a reel. And that was real money if you're broken 21 years old. And the studio time was a couple $1,000s. So, there were huge barriers to music happening. It also, I think people who are older get cranky about music and they're inclined to dismiss it now because, it was it was better. It's all a mess now. And I just think that's really a function of not having the time that we once did to go deep and burrow in and find stuff. And there's just more stuff to go through than ever. So, I mean, I don't do that. I don't follow music as obsessively as I used to. I can't. And it can take up even more time than it did when I was doing it. And I want to be clear, when it was just records and tapes and CDs, it took up all my time keeping up. But,
well, I have good news.
But I mean, it's out there.
I have some good news for you. Actually, Karin's niece plays in a band, a Swedish band. They're both in Sweden, but they play in a band. One is called Peter, Bjorn, and John. She's in that, and her,
of course.
And they're now touring the United States. I think she's in Colorado, and
they're kind of a big deal.
They're a big deal, but her other nephew or cousin, Vidar is his name. He's actually leading this band that's all indie synth. So indie synth is taking over Sweden. So it's kind of like taking back that whole indie synth movement that existed back in the.
Well, I mean, it's funny. I think at this point you can just find, a thriving subculture around any kind of music. I could find 1,000 bands today, if I wanted to, that are essentially essaying Italian disco from the early 80s, which, by the way, is a thing. And the best Italian disco from the early 80s is fucking unbelievable. It is super cool and super weird. And what you're talking about with your cousin's band, I mean, to me, that sounds like an outgrowth of what was going on in New York and elsewhere in the 90s and the early 2000s. The biggest band to come out of that was probably LCD Sound System, who are, still going. But I mean, all this stuff exists, punk rock exists, hardcore exists, straight edge hardcore exists, Christian hardcore exists, metal exists, heavy metal exists, death metal exists, Christian death metal exists. I mean, you can subdivide and all this stuff is out there.
Christian,
and that's just,
they have Christian heavy metal, Finnish music exists.
Yeah, totally. With all the what are the motifs of death metal, vocals that are and what's called blast beat drumming, which is this crazy. I mean, it's all out there. And I remember just sort of tripping out on this, thanks to my friends at the dearly departed Aquarius Records. When they'd be there's this they're sort of a death metal band. They're from Holland, but they're sort of affiliated with the crust punk movement. And by the way, they have a saxophone player, you know. Or there's a death metal band and the singer is a parrot, which by the way exists. I think they're called Hatebeak. I mean, you know, and it's just endlessly thrilling to me that this stuff exists. And maybe I don't remember who I was talking about this recently, but 125 years ago, you know, there wasn't really a music industry. There was live performance and a few stars, but not much else. And music was something that people did. Music was something that people shared and they did together. You know, there wasn't a lot of ways to entertain yourself, so you just sort of gather around and play music. And there was someone in your family who could sing well, and there was someone in your family who could play guitar, and others who were less good. But I mean, you know, it was just something that people did, and maybe that's what it's going back to. And, you know, in terms of societal good, you know, maybe that's not terrible.
Well, it's interesting also, I think, you know, today, everybody seems to be so passionate about what they're doing, whether they're into the heavy metal bands that you talked about with the singing parrot or not. They seem to be really into it. But I noticed when I read your book, Your Band Sucks, that in the 90s you note that bands didn't seem to care about anything. They projected no sexuality or interest in the pleasure principle, displayed, you know, meager instrumental skills, but they began to gain tremendous popularity as underachievers.
Well, wait, I want to walk you back a little bit on that. I mean, I was talking about one very specific subset of indie music in the 80s and 90s where, yeah, there was kind of this willful modesty, and you know, it was a point of pride. I mean, I happened to join.
Was that your band? Were you guys like that?
You know, we were unusual in that accidentally the bassist and the drummer were amazing, like really great. The bassist had been playing multiple instruments since he was like 10. He was pretty much a fully developed songwriter at the age of 18, and the drummer, whose name is Orestes Morphine, was seriously one of the best drummers in the world, and nobody knew it. And like, I want to be clear, if anyone is listening to this and rolling their eyes, I know way fucking more about music than you, and I've heard way more drummers, and I'm right and you're wrong, so fuck off. But there was a modesty, and I was terrible. I had to like learn to catch up with them, and you know, I was the one who couldn't play, but you know, eventually I could. And you know, it's a big punk rock thing. You know, this is important. It's rock music. This isn't, you know, like reconstructive surgery. You don't have to be a fucking expert to play it. Like it can be 3 chords and like and a irresistible hook, or it can be, you know, 2 chords and a drone you can't get out of your head. That's some of my favorite stuff in the world. Why we were so pleasure averse is because we were basically a reaction to 80s hair metal, which was all about the party and all about the chicks and all about primping and looking good, and the music fucking sucked. And the way you can tell that is that there are no bands that are actually influenced by that anymore. Like, that stuff disappeared. And while I do feel, as in the subtitle of my book, that whatever revolution we wanted with indie rock or punk rock failed, you know, we killed that shit. I mean, when Nirvana got big, and I don't even like Nirvana that much, but when they got big and when bands that came out of our culture came big, Soundgarden, Helmet, again, not my favorite bands, but they were of the culture, you know, all the Poison and bands like that went from playing football stadiums to arenas to clubs in the span of like a year. It just fucking disappeared. And I feel that my people in this subculture can hold our heads up high for doing that.
Wow, that's amazing. How did you guys come up with the name Bitch Magnet?
The anecdote is in the book. But I mean, like, we were 18-year-olds sitting around our college radio station. We had a flyer, which is how you got the word out for shows, of our first performance, and it was completely done except for the place where we were going to put our name. And someone in the room made a joke about a DJ at the radio station who had fabulous success with women, and I made a joke referencing like he's a bitch magnet, which is like some really crude Southern slang. And the bassist in my band was like, "That's it." And the next thing I know, he was pasting up the letters for bitch magnet on the flyer, and I was like, "Well, I guess that's the name." I want to be clear. We were 18. We were not thinking for the long term. You know, I'm not walking away from that name. I don't apologize for that name. Some people, when our records were reissued in 2011, said, "This is a really great and interesting band. Thank you." And one reason why no one knows about that is probably because they chose a really fucking stupid name. It's like, yeah, guilty. What can I tell you? You know, we lost a few gigs because of it. I mean, we were also going to Oberlin, which then as well as now was deeply PC, as they say. And obviously, we were trying to poke the beast a little bit. But I mean, we were sitting around a radio station, like I had no idea I'd be talking about this. Oh my God, almost 30 years after the fact. Or that we would be, playing shows in Asia and Europe and America in 2011 and 2012, 25 years after that conversation. We were 18. We were fucking idiots. We weren't thinking about the long term.
When you were 18 years old and you came up with Bitch Magnet, though, you have definitely had some kind of desire to change the world or do something, leave a mark, so that, the name, I mean, you can look back on it and say what you want, but it certainly has a cachet to it. It's got a sort of, you can't, I don't think you forget about it.
Yeah, I know, but the thing that I learned much later is that you don't want a band name where people can hear it and think that you're not serious about music or that it's some kind of joke. Like, this was not a joke. I mean, we lived and died with it. We slaved over our music. We made 3 vastly different records that I'm still really proud of. And I was 19 when I recorded the first one. I mean, I'll stand that shit up to almost anything. And I've been lucky to make a living off of creative work. I've written for magazines, edited magazines, written a book, and I'm nearing 50. And I know that on my deathbed, there are some Bitch Magnet songs that will be among the proudest things I've done, without question.
So can writing ever usurp actually the feel of playing music live as the ultimate power trip in your mind? Like when you're on stage and you're feeling it and the music's coming out and you're connecting with the audience. Can you get anywhere close to that when you're writing?
I don't want to underestimate the pleasures of writing are very strange. But this is not my line, but I don't like writing. I like being finished with writing. You just have to get through the writing to get to that feeling. And I don't want to complain about writing the book because writers like to complain about how hard the job is. And it's you're not digging ditches when it's 120 degrees out. You're not working at a McDonald's and trying to raise 2 kids while you're working at McDonald's 30 hours a week. That's fucking hard. This is moving sentences around on a computer screen. There are very unique satisfactions with it that are very profound. And, if most writers, I think if they're honest, they will admit that there's an aggression to it and a mania to be heard that is one of the driving forces. But I mean, there's nothing like being in a rock band on stage. There just isn't. And one of my favorite, I interviewed about 60 musicians and people from, the kind of independent rock subculture for the book. And one of the many favorite things that someone told me was mentioned by Clay Tarver, who was in the 80s and 90s. He was in bands Chavez and Bolt La Volta. He's now he's one of the executive producers on Silicon Valley. And he said, going on tour is so much fun that it kind of makes you crazy. And it does. I mean, it's like the ups and downs of every day. It's amazing, and it makes you insane. And to take that further, that chasing that feeling, kind of ruined my life in some ways, And there are people I know that it definitely ruined their lives because these are people who went so deep in it they can't have a job, they can't do anything else, and they keep. There's almost a factor of addiction to it because being on stage is such a multidimensional thing when it's clicking. It's there's the absolute sheer volume of what you're putting out. You're literally feeling it in your bones. I mean, it's 120 decibels. The lights are in your face. It's hot as fuck. There's this intense communion with the people in the band you're playing with. It's almost telepathic. You're anticipating stuff and you're trying to fake each other out, but you're there with each other. And then all this energy that you're throwing out is coming right back at you from the crowd. I mean, it's really, I don't know. It's sexual. It's like heroin. I miss it.
Is it everything you just described?
I've never done heroin, by the way. I've never done heroin.
I'll note that. We'll note that, of course. But the power that you just talked about, everything you described, is it really a reflection of the power of the youth, or is it a result of that that experience? Is that what you get?
The feeling that's a really interesting question. The feeling got really inextricably tied with, the kind of male, I don't know, sex drive, warrior urge, whatever you want to call it. That kind of, those hormones. which, when you're 18 are running pretty high and you don't kind of know what the fuck to do with them. As those of us who are now around teenagers know, like you can kind of see them sort of freaking out from their internal chemistries because it's so intense and they just don't have any experience with it. But at the same time, I did all this stuff again when I was in my 40s. And I mean, I fucking felt it. I mean, like, just needle in the goddamn vein, man, like adrenaline shot straight to the heart. I felt it. You still feel it.
You did that in 2011. What exactly did you do?
So, Bitch Magnet, which was a band that was that was between 1986 and 1990. That was my first band. We did 3 records, and we toured Europe and America. I mean, we weren't famous by any stretch. I write about this in the book, but we were known enough in this subculture and known enough to enough people to be able to go on tour and sell records, and like you see little bits of money here and there. So I did a bunch of other bands until 2005, 2006, toured America, toured Asia. In 2011, Bitch Magnet's entire catalog was reissued by the wonderful people at Temporary Residence Limited Records. And we got asked to reunite for a festival in the UK called All Tomorrow's Parties. And this was complicated because at that point we lived in 3 countries. I lived in New York, the drummer lived in Calgary, and the bassist, who is also the vocalist, lived in Singapore. Wow. So it was complicated, but number one, it was clear there was some kind of audience. Number two, All Tomorrow's Parties made a pretty generous offer, and we were like, well, it costs thousands of dollars for us to get in the room together, but we can do this. And so then it's like, well, if we're doing this, if we're going to play All Tomorrow's Parties, we should play these shows in Europe. And Sue Young, our bass player, lives in Singapore, so we should probably practice out there, and we should probably do some shows. I can get us a show in Tokyo, so you can get us a show in Seoul. So we did that too. And America was the obvious thing because it was the last tour we booked, and I'm glad we did. As
you describe it, it's an interesting. It's a really interesting insight into sort of young males. I mean, you could almost argue it's also young men and women.
It is for sure. I mean, I can only speak to the male experience, but I mean, you definitely see it.
Especially these days. You see it in a big way. Maybe not as much back then. But
one of the things I'm proud about our indie rock, I have still hard time with the word subculture, is that it was the beginning of women really kind of taking the reins and playing much more active roles in bands than they had before. And progress was slow as it usually is, but it led to other things.
When you're 20 something and you've got this sort of awesome power, this sort of force that's inside of you that you look out in the world and you go, fuck, everything is wrong, everything has to be righted. And that energy that you put into this music and the punk scene that was the 80s. If you look at 2016 today and you look at the world, what can that power represent, that idealism? How does it manifest itself today? Not in music, but in culture.
Yeah, no. I mean, well, the obvious thing, and I paused for a second because I didn't want to say the obvious thing. I mean, there was a great deal of youth and energy behind what looked like a pretty unlikely long shot bid for the Democratic nomination, and Bernie Sanders got a hell of a lot farther than I think pretty much anyone thought. And that was you saw the people that came out to see him. The younger voters were really well represented. That's a good example. I mean, I tend to think of it in terms of activism, and that's where you see it the most. I'm probably thinking about it in activism because I pay much more closer attention to politics and activism than I do to music right now. I mean, I'm sure there are pissed off 18-year-olds right now, men and women, just being like, all of you grown-ups, this is bullshit. Your music is bullshit. Your culture is bullshit. We are going to do this, and you will see that we're right. And you know what? That's exactly what they should. If I put up a building, culturally speaking, that I'm proud of, they should still want to fucking tear it down. That's what this is all about. And I'm not the hugest fan of this band either necessarily, but when REM, I'm going way back, when they were becoming a really big deal and they were being deified in the mid 80s, someone asked, Peter Buck, one of those horrible highfalutin questions, what do you think REM's influence will ultimately be on music 50 years from now? And he was like, I don't really know, but the thing that's actually exciting is that someone is going to hear our music and they're going to say, REM fucking sucks, and they're so terrible, I'm going to start a fucking band and I'm going to show them. And that band will be like the next Velvet Underground or the next Stooges, and that is what's really exciting. And that remains to this day. I mean, it's tricky when you're an actual grown up, but it's like, yeah, the whole point of being a teenager is that they're supposed to want to blow all of our stuff up.
So if you go back to yourself at that time, if you think about it, what was the hole in your life you're trying to fill?
So I was deeply into music, and I felt that the radio, we remember radio. I don't know if radio really exists anymore, but the radio was how you found out about music, and it was the only channel to hear this stuff. And I hated a lot of what was on the radio, and on a very personal level, I felt like musicians and bands were lying to me. I felt that they weren't writing stuff that was reflecting, the emotional states of myself and the people I liked, who are all, by the way, outcasts that were completely fucking despised by 95% of our hometown. But, like I would hear some, maroon like Howard Jones, like he would be on MTV with a song called Things Can Only Get Better. And I'd be like, fuck you. Like, things suck and they're getting worse. And you're lying to me. And like, as sort of childish as it sounds, like, that was how I felt.
So you weren't into Rick Astley or anything like that?
Yeah, Rick Astley, I've really barely heard Rick Astley, to be honest with you. Like, he kind of came later. And, at a certain point, I was able to discover a subculture that was building itself up when this crap like Howard Jones was everywhere. And like, I didn't spend a lot of time with the mainstream after that because it bored me shitless, and like our stuff was better. There are people I know. So my niece, who's 13, who I adore more than like almost anything in the world, save for my wife, she is in love with Hamilton. And so she's like all excited. She's like, Uncle John's into music. She's like, Uncle John, you've got to listen to Hamilton. And I'm like, yeah, like, I don't know how to tell you this. It's not really my thing. And I was kind of playing with her, and I was like, all right, so here's how Uncle John understands music like that. Don't tell me like what the hit, like what like everyone's favorite song off the Hamilton soundtrack is. Tell me like what the weird song is. Like, what's the fucked up song that nobody likes? Like, what's the song that kind of sticks out? Because that's what Uncle John's going to get excited about. And she was like, yeah, there kind of isn't one. And I'm like, well, not that interested. So I just didn't interface much with Rick Astley. Like, I'm pretty sure at this point I've heard Taylor Swift just because she seems to be everywhere, but like I've never knowingly heard Taylor Swift, and so I'm pretty confident I've never heard Justin Bieber either. It's like fuck all that shit. And by the way, Taylor Swift is probably, she might be really good. I don't know. Justin Bieber, I'm sure, totally sucks.
But you have this sort of like, and it's really interesting. Like, I think inherent in you is like the sort of fuck the mainstream and the sort of desire to find the broken edge somewhere on the side in the periphery, something that's not, the polished and the middle. And I think inherent in a lot of leaders that I've spoken with who run movements, who try to change things, they have the same approach. And it's not in everybody. Most people prefer the shiny, happy middle. It's quite unusual. And it's is it like a environmental thing? Were you born with it, or did someone teach you? Did you follow? Like, how did you personally kind of start to become that person?
To become the person that is kind of attracted to the middle, or the person who is like trying to cut himself on the jagged edge?
The jagged edge, because you're not in the middle.
Well,
unless you've evolved,
I'm a lot more in the middle than I used to be. Which is totally fine. I don't know. I was just attracted to the stuff that excited me. I was just attracted to the stuff that was interesting to me. I was attracted to the people that were interesting and different. And, there was a lot more, marginalization of cultures in the 80s. In the 80s, it was, I'm not saying this to say that it's easy by any stretch to be gay in America now, but it was pretty hard to be gay almost anywhere in America now. Almost anywhere in America in the 80s, And, these were the interesting people. They were the unusual people. They had much more interesting ideas. Who the fuck wants to hang out with the popular kids? Like, maybe the popular kids today are really cool. I don't know. I'm in New York City, and they kind of do seem sort of cool. But, who wants a life that's based around, high school football games and like, just like Instagram's full of, like fall color and like pumpkin spice lattes. Seriously, like, don't people want more than that? Like, isn't there like a great hunger in us for something? For me, this was how it expressed itself.
So you had that sort of music scene you have young people, punk rock came out. There was obviously economic instability that helped to stimulate, that whole scene in the UK and then obviously later in the US.
And I mean, I want to back you up on that
Yep.
because most of the people that are deepest involved in this are like middle class, white kids who went to art school or the equivalent. Like Joe Strummer grew up very comfortably in the Clash. I really dislike the Clash, but I mean, he's kind of an important figure. Wire, which is a band I adore, who are still going and they're in their 70s. Probably the most important band to come out of the 70s UK punk scene. They were an art school band. Like, I grew up pretty damn comfortably. Like, I grew up in a big suburban house. I had my own bedroom. I mean, most of the people in bands in my thing did too, because you almost needed the fallback of like a parent's house to crash at. There was no money in this. It was difficult to do on nothing.
Did you ever watch the TV series Vinyl?
Yeah, it's fucking awful. Jesus fucking Christ, man. How disappointing.
You see the band that was kind of a little bit like a punk band.
Jesus fucking Christ!
Yeah.
Are you trying to piss me off?
No, what was interesting about them is they were kind of like skid kids. They weren't the middle class comfortable kids that you're describing. They seem
but let's unpack.
I know their characters.
But like that was like Mick Jagger's, and by the way, Mick Jagger's son coincidentally playing the singer and being fucking terrible as an actor. And Martin Scorsese's idea of what punk rock was like, and it's obviously preposterous. Any musician who is remotely familiar with the settings of live music will say that the live music stuff in vinyl is completely fucking preposterous, that their entire notion of what it's like to be in a band is completely preposterous. The band's interactions with a major label are completely preposterous. It was a deeply troubled show that could have been really great in the hands of other people. Having said that, Ray Romano is a neurotic Jew, like 5 gold stars. Unbelievable.
But they still, at the same time, keyed into something that was going on in society. I mean, punk succeeded because it was, as you say, an activist culture that just seemed to catch people at a time when things needed to change. I mean, there was a lot of things people were fighting against, whether it was apartheid or it was social injustices, whatever it was. Punk came in, it sort of turned around, the 70s love in. It was like from we're all together loving each other to, fuck, we got to change everything. And there was an anger. And the point I'm making is, if you look now, fast forward to 2016, there's a fuck of a lot of anger out there, but there isn't a lot of music. And
no! Well, there's so much music. There's more music than ever.
Yeah.
I mean,
just
because there aren't like the giant channels, it's a distribution issue. Like just because there aren't the giant channels that there used to be, and also, frankly, Scott, you and I aren't paying that close attention anymore. Like I mean, if you and I wanted to, like we're both in New York City right now, right?
Yeah.
All right. So I bet if we wanted to, and we looked, like within 50 miles of where we're sitting, we could find 5 hardcore shows going on in a basement tonight. If we wanted to find that out, like we just don't. I mean, like that's still out there. And I also got to tell you, like I'm always a little leery of finding the cultural resonances with cultural movements. I'm sorry, finding the broader cultural resonance with artistic movements. I mean, to me, the most American punk rock band was Black Flag. They kind of incredibly important. Great band. They carved out the entire independent circuit. They created the idea of what an independent label is, without which any of what we're talking about was impossible. They created the touring circuit on which all these bands play. They were the first unusual band to go out in a lot of these places. They got really violent and strange reactions from people because of that. Black Flag was apolitical in their music. They did not have the most evolved attitudes towards women. And I mean, if you talk to each of them individually, I bet you'll find out that they were either kind of right wing or generally libertarian or apolitical. Like to me, the Sex Pistols and Wire are much more interesting and much better bands than like the Clash. The Clash were overtly political. The Sex Pistols have an anti-abortion song on their first album. Like Wire didn't really write about politics. I don't know how they vote. I don't know if they voted pro-Brexit or not. I kind of don't care. It's a little dangerous to assume that just because of like fucking, boring mainstream shit like Bruce Springsteen and U2 have these sort of feel-good lefty attitudes. I mean, that's not necessarily widely shared. Like musicians who are serious about music want to do music. And like I can find lefty hardcore bands that I really like, but I can also find right wing hardcore bands I really like.
But there's something about like angry young men. Like there's lots of great quotes of angry young men, without jobs or without access to females or whatever it is, they become incredibly destructive, or they can be destructive. And you look out in the world today, and you see both constructive people, but you see a lot of young men and women, but mostly men. And I'm not just talking about the U.S., but just beyond the U.S. that have this incredible energy and destructive energy. And it's I don't know, maybe I'm missing it, and you're right. I'm definitely of a different generation than I was in the past. But I just wonder whether the music scene doesn't touch people the way it used to, or maybe it does, but in it's such a splintered way that it just doesn't connect us in a bigger world. So it's so splintered that we just don't connect as a bigger group of people. So I remember when The Clash came out, I mean, it definitely connected with a broad group of people. And whatever your political views were, you went, okay, that band was super cool. I liked their music. And whether you were British or South African or Canadian or whatever,
we'll agree to disagree on the quality of The Clash. But carry on, sir. Carry on.
No, but I think there was at least anyway some kind of connectivity between people. Now it seems there isn't any of that. And so,
but the connections are, number one, Scott, honestly, we're both, grown-ass men in our 40s. I mean, we're too old to know. What the youth is doing is going to be kind of invisible to us, and it should be. Right. But there are so many different ways to connect. I mean, there's the obvious shit like Snapchat and Facebook. There are online communities that are grouped around really intense interests. And honestly, the music scene is really splintered, but yeah, maybe that's probably how it should be, because I remember when it was centralized and it sucked. And I also remembered when I realized that the centralized music scene sucked, and it was just like FM radio and MTV playing the same 12 videos over and over again. And I was like, I know there's something else out there. And I'm actually reading about something else out there, but it took me 3 years to find it. I mean, if someone is interested in hardcore or dance music or, God help us, dubstep, which is horrible, or, I don't know, like crazy psych folk music, I mean, they can find it in 10 minutes. That's really powerful. Yeah. And I mean, misdirected male anger is a huge societal problem. Always was, always will be. I don't know where, but there are more bands now than ever. So that to me argues that at least a decent percentage, and probably more of a percentage of people, are channeling it that way, because it was just harder. You had to really want this in the 80s to do it.
So if you're a musician today, you want to start a band, what do you do?
Really good question. You start trying to develop an online community around yourselves as quickly as possible. You try to associate yourselves with other like-minded online communities. You do some of the stuff that, honestly, we did in the 80s. You find the like-minded bands. You forge connections with them. You play in each other's hometowns. You put music up online with some regularity, although you don't just throw everything that you did up there. And you try to create, where possible, scarcity around objects. The smart record labels that are doing it will do a limited run of a record, kind of collector's editions of records, and it's slightly hokey, but it works. And there's some weird alchemy to this. It works better for certain bands than others, but when it works, it really works. And, you're just trying to find ways to. And the other thing is you can actually have a much deeper connection with your audience now than in the 80s. I mean, I remember in the 80s, you would go to the P.O. box that your band rented, once a month, and take out this, hopefully, passel of postcards, people writing your band, and maybe you'd get around to writing back. But, it was a little daunting. You had to write it out, put a stamp on it, take it to the post box. It's a pain in the ass. Now there's just this instantaneous communication. The trick with that, obviously, is not to get so sucked into it that that's all you do, which is something I hear from friends of mine who are involved in that.
Well, this has been an amazing discussion. We've touched everything from the 1980s punk scene to Angry Young Men to your reunion tour. I saw this really great quote, actually, when I was looking up just reviews about your book, and it said that, I imagine in a small van, Jon Fine is very hard to take.
I love that so much. Yeah, that was someone on Amazon. I pulled that. I'm putting this fucking everywhere.
I thought that was super good. Well,
that was awesome.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time, and I think everyone who's listening does as well. So,
my absolute pleasure.
Yeah, a pleasure, and look forward to your next gig. Let us know when that is. Okay, that's good.
Talk to you soon.
Thank you. Thank you for joining our Uprising today. and listening to our show. If you missed the show, or if you want to find out more about who was on, or if you want to learn more about how to create your own Uprising, please go to uprisingmovements.com. You can also download this Uprising program from iTunes. Uprising was produced by Nicola Keneally and Adam Helen, with special help from Melanie Boardman, Karin Drachenberg, Philippa Freeman, Brianna Campbell, Fashad Faroudi, Mark Bruzy, Will Issam, James Politi, and Jonathan Weeks. My name is Scott Goodson, and you've been listening to Uprising. What we can learn about movements and uprisings that are shaping our world in business, in society, and in between. For more on cultural movements and movement marketing, be sure to pick up a copy of the best-selling book Uprising, How to Build a Brand and Change the World by Sparking Cultural Movements, available on Amazon.com. Music for Uprising composed by Charles Duchateau.